This is the finest experience in economic presentation and gathering in the world. INET has been exploring perhaps an extension of the Trento Economic Festival to places like India or Hangzhou in China. So I must say we concur with this notion of the quality of the experience, but I say that with a cautious note because the quality of the experience involves things like the people, the mountains, and the wine. So I also would say there is something very interesting about the culture here. Economics is referred to as the dismal science, but INET senior fellow Adair Turner came here a couple of years ago, and after giving the speech, he looked at me and smiled, and he said, "My God, the words economics and festival never appear together, and it works here in Trento." So I think this is a joyous experience. I come back every year, and I want to encourage you to feel very good about what it is that you experience. As a matter of personal testimony, I must say I knew that this was an extraordinary experience today at lunch, because the willpower it took for me not to have a glass of red grain wine so that I could remain clear as your moderator was very, very difficult. And that pain tells me this is an extraordinary place to be. The Institute for New Economic Thinking looks for people to share their research support and share them to, say, an audience like this festival, who are thinking different, thinking innovatively, thinking creatively, and often that is what you might say aligned with a notion of courage. Our speaker today, Dr. Paul Romer from New York University, when I thought to ask him and discussed it with Tito, he reminded me of someone who originally brought me here to Trento. Dr. Axel Leonhoefed was a very independent scholar, an imagination that created research like no one else in the profession was creating from a very early point in his career. He was here running a summer school, which he still continues to be on the committee to lead, but Axel Leonhoefed inspired me to come here and then join him up in Holzerand with my family for a little bit of time thereafter. And Axel was one of these people at University of California in Los Angeles who wasn't in the Chicago school, wasn't in the Keynesian school, wasn't in a fight with everybody, but everybody thought he was brilliant and creative. And that reminded me of Paul Romer. Paul Romer was educated at University of Chicago, but you can read on his blog, which I encourage you all to do, about the problems of mathiness in economics, about the tribal customs in macroeconomics, about the behavior of the freshwater school of which his own thesis advisor, Robert Lucas, was the leader. And he's exploring these things in public, which is a courage and an integrity that INET seeks out and seeks to share, particularly with the young scholars around the world, so they can carve out a meaningful career for themselves from the examples of these mentors. Paul's blog includes many things. I read an essay this morning related to the famous physicist Feynman called Feynman Integrity, about how one approaches scientific investigation. Paul is known for innovations in endogenous growth theory, and he is currently totally immersed and totally involved in the question of cities and economic geography that are at the center of this conference. So I would like to, express to you that INET feels very grateful and very fortunate that Paul could join us today via video and present his discussion. Tito Boeri will join me in a few minutes and then lead the questioning. And but Paul will speak before that. I haven't, let's see, there he is. Hey, Paul. We'll let you take it from here.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's a little intimidating to have to follow that generous introduction, particularly to think about the challenge of keeping the spirit of the economics and festival joined together. The topic I want to address is one that's grim, but I hope I can bring a little sense of optimism to a kind of a grim background. The way I would characterize the topic is how the world responds to failed states. It's manifesting right now in a refugee crisis, but I think the underlying problem is that of failed states. And the reality we face is that billions of people live in failed or failing states, and those of us who are fortunate enough to live in a successful state have to decide what is our kind of moral obligation in the face of the suffering of people living in those failed states. Now, I want to use an analogy with a battlefield where when there are many wounded, we continue to respond with something like the idealism of a chaplain, but we also rely on the pragmatism of a medic. The idealism includes a commitment to some notion of treating everybody the same, inclusion, equal treatment, but yet the essence of what a medic has to do on the battlefield is engage in a kind of triage exercise where limited medical resources are focused on the few where they'll offer the most benefit. I think the discussion about failed states needs more of this pragmatism of the medic, and that has to complement the idealism. It's not inherently inconsistent with that idealism, but it's operating on a different time scale. The idealism still tells us where we want to end up as a goal, but the pragmatism is essential for being realistic about how we get there. I think the two key elements of the idealism are, first, that we want to support the ideal of self-determination in the different nations of the world. And we'd also like to support the ideal of the open society, as articulated, for example, by Karl Popper, where people are free to move between different nations that operate under democratic self-determination. We can support that as an ideal, but we have to recognize that we're very far away from that right now, and that makes it difficult to know how to get to our ultimate goal. Most people on Earth, the majority of people on Earth, live in places that do not have states that function as well as the states of Western Europe and North America and other European outposts. The U.S. response, if I can characterize it, has been roughly to try and intervene militarily to create the conditions for effective local self-determination. So think about an invasion in Haiti where we run an election, invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan where we also organized elections. You can think about a European response, which is closer to an implementation of the open society approach, where Europe has tried to accommodate asylum seekers who are escaping from conditions of violence and lack of opportunity. The U.S. response has failed in a really spectacular way after the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Even the Haiti invasion, I think we would look back and say that it didn't really lead to any effective change. But Iraq and Afghanistan were clearly failures, and the United States is now essentially retreating into a disengaged position, which is, I think, really hard to justify in any kind of moralistic ground. The Europeans started out in the face of the wave of refugees coming out of Syria, trying to accommodate larger numbers of immigrants, and quickly found that the larger flow was inconsistent with its existing democratic institutions. Voters in Europe did not want to accept more refugees, and democracy is, of course, one of the ideals that we want to support. So I think Europe has been pushed into a situation where it can't afford total disengagement, but it is basically trying to let in a very small number of asylum seekers and set up barriers that impede the flow of the very large number of people who'd like to get to someplace where they can enjoy opportunity and security. And as a consequence of those barriers, what we're seeing is, thousands of people dying, making these dangerous boat crossings across the Mediterranean. So let me try and articulate an example of a more pragmatic approach inspired by the idea of the medic. And let me acknowledge that this approach, or any similar pragmatic approach, will involve compromises. Any of these compromises could be challenged. So the real goal here is not so much to say that the solution I'm going to articulate is the solution, but to say this is the space within which we have to start to explore. These are the possibilities we have to consider. And we have to be willing to recognize that temporary compromises and accommodations with just the reality of our resources, those have to be constraints that we recognize and try and work around. Now, to motivate this, let me give you a suggestion for how the United States could have responded differently. It invaded, it's been about 1.6 trillion US, trying to occupy about 1 million square kilometers of land in Iraq and Afghanistan, and occupy them for roughly 10 years. Now, the United States could instead have scaled back the amount of land it tried to occupy by a factor of 10, and could then have stayed for 10 times as long. So imagine it had occupied 100,000 square kilometers for 100 years. That arguably would have been feasible with the same resources, and would have given a different environment where something like democratic self-determination could have emerged. So it's an example of the kinds of trade-offs we have to face. And under that kind of scenario, we might say, well, getting to democracy is still where we want to go, but we might have to allow a longer period of time to get to where we want. Now, let me describe this from the perspective of the European response. The European response is fundamentally that Europe can't afford to take in hundreds of thousands of additional refugees, certainly not millions or tens of millions of refugees, but this is the scale of the potential flows here. So the question for Europe is either insist that all these people have to stay where they are, even though we have no prospect for improving the quality of life where they live, or we find someplace else they can go. We could support the idea that people should be free to leave without saying they should all be able to enter Europe, but to do that, we have to have some feasible proposal for where people who want to flee violence could go. And the example, I think, from history that could guide us is Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a case where a European power, Britain, provided security guarantees for a city, so a smaller piece of area, not an entire country, and allowed enough time for society to evolve in the direction of democratic self-control. That evolution was interrupted by the handover back to mainland China, but if it had not been interrupted, you could imagine it would have evolved the way, say, British control of Mauritius evolved into a stable democracy there. So what would the characteristics of a new Hong Kong be? And I'll be specific. You'd need about 1,000 square kilometers, and let's imagine for the moment that some European power entered into a lease with some part of the Libyan government on 1,000 square miles on the coast, on the Libyan coast. 1,000 square kilometers, excuse me, on the Libyan coast. The political arrangement there is that this, like Hong Kong, this jurisdiction would not be a part of any European state. People who came and lived there would not become European citizens. They would not have a claim on asylum in Europe. But the power that organized this could offer what they called the right of abode in Hong Kong. When millions of Chinese were fleeing the civil war in China, they had an offer to live permanently in Hong Kong and have the right to seek employment, bring their families there, and enjoy the benefits of security and opportunity. This is offering part of what we think the refugees would like. It does not offer them the chance to participate as voters in a determination of the political arrangements that they live under. But this is the kind of arrangement which could allow that democratic system to emerge over time. I think it's also interesting to think about the possibility of that process leading to local democracy proceeding more quickly or more slowly. Because we don't know for sure what it takes and how long it takes to build an effective democracy. You could imagine starting one of these new Hong Kongs with a commitment that within 5 years there will be local control. And let me be specific about what that means. That means there will be an election that determines who is in charge of the police force that maintains safety there in the zone. Imagine another zone that where the commitment is that the external European power will have an appointed official who provides accountability for the security forces, and we'll do so for 50 years instead of 5 years. So it's still an arrangement where democratic accountability limits what the head of the police force can do, but it's the voters in Europe who hold accountable their leaders who appoint the person who is in charge of the police force in this zone. Now, the interesting question is, if you imagine, say, groups that have been in conflict with each other, Sunnis and Shiites, for example, would they actually prefer to go to a zone where the transition is going to happen within 5 years, or would they prefer to go to a zone where the transition could take 50 years? I think it would be interesting to run that experiment, give people that choice. I have a feeling that many might prefer the zone where it's going to take 50 years, because holding an election too soon is a very destabilizing thing. If there's a small majority of, say, the Sunnis, the Shiites will worry that it'll be a Sunni-controlled militia, and that it'll be used to oppress the Shiites. So they'll either try to stop the inflow of more Sunnis, encourage the inflow of more Shiites, perhaps engage in violence to prevent the transition to the democratic arrangement, so that the early transition to an election could actually be very destabilizing, whereas the one which takes place over a much longer period of time could give everybody an assurance that once it takes place, they won't have to worry about the emergence of a kind of a warlord that will oppress one group. So if we're willing to think like a medic and think what's feasible right now, I think we could provide zones that could accommodate, each one of these new Hong Kongs could accommodate something like 10 million people. They can actually be self-financing, because if people can move into a place and work, as they did in Hong Kong, they pay taxes and can cover the costs of local government. So you could take tens of millions of people in each of these. They could rely on some security guarantees in the beginning, but it really at very little fiscal cost. I think in terms of security, if you go back to the scaling back I said for the United States, 1/10 the area would be 100,000 square kilometers. That would be enough for 100 Hong Kong-like zones. So it'd be well within the realm of feasibility to provide security for a few of these. And in terms of locations, along the Libyan coast, you could, there's room for 50 square parcels the size of Hong Kong. If you look more broadly at, say, the coast of the Western Sahara, there'd be room for another 15. And so what we should think of is these locations, the unoccupied locations on these coasts, as opportunities for gains from trade. There's a deal that could be done where some European power enters voluntarily into an agreement with the affected parties in Libya or the Western Sahara. In the Western Sahara, Morocco would have to be a participant in the discussions. But it's perfectly feasible to imagine, a handful, 5, maybe 10 different locations that could grow to the size of a modern city of 10 million people. This would be a response at the kind of scale that the world needs right now, and I think it's one which is more likely to get us to the goal that the ideal we believe in, than the path that we're currently on. So let me pause with that overview and open it up to questions and discussion.
Okay. Paul, when you talk about setting up at the onset a new Hong Kong, do you see a consortium of advanced nations acting as what you might call the seed capital behind it? Or are you recommending the United States or Europe or whatever?
Yeah. My guess right now is that Europe will take the lead. I think, to be honest, I think the United States is paralyzed. So imagine it's a European power, and I think it's quite possible that this could be an existing European state. It could also be an EU initiative, but I think the resource demands here are not large. So it's well within the powers of, I think, Germany, Sweden, Britain, any of these countries, Italy, any of them could, I think, take this initiative on.
Paul, this is Tito BOERI. I missed the very beginning of your talk, so I hope not to say something that you already said before.
Okay.
Well, there is a fundamental difference between refugee migration and economic migration. And this is related to the fact that it is a push migration. People are leaving from an area of conflict, and they come in very large waves, while economic migration is more gradual, typically. At the same time, even the refugees have some economic motivations. So they leave a country and they aim at going to an area of, say, prosperity, but certainly of better living conditions. Indeed, the refugees, when they come to Europe, they don't want to go anywhere where they can be secure in Europe. They want to go to Germany or to Sweden, to the countries where there are more economic opportunities. So how would your proposal fit into this, say, motivations and of the refugees?
Sure. So I think it's a somewhat arbitrary distinction between, say, economic migration and the migration that comes from escaping violence. And I think it would be good from our perspective if we could accommodate everybody. So you think about the parents of children who just want their children to live someplace safe, and they want to work in a job, and then they want their children to get an education. These are things that we'd like to encourage for everybody. I think it's this sense of infeasibility and scarce resources that makes us fall back into the position of saying the only ones we can help are the extremes, the people under the most extreme threat of violence, and we'll give them asylum. So you might keep that asylum policy in place for positions within Europe, but you could say to everyone else, if you want to go someplace where you can be safe and get a job, we can help create that. And I think we have to remember that Hong Kong was a source of immense opportunity for people when they were fleeing from mainland China. It was not the opportunity of the welfare state, but it was the opportunity of the chance to get a job and to work, and for your children to get an education. That's the opportunity we can afford, and I think it's the opportunity that most refugees want. So the essence of making this work is some democracy which takes responsibility for appointing somebody who's in charge of, say, the perimeter security force in a city like this, but also the police force that operates inside the city. This is a key role for the European power. Beyond that, you have to give the people who move there the opportunity to build the city that they will live in. So we shouldn't think of this as being something that involves huge capital outlays before people show up. This is not the way cities have emerged historically. Think of this as a place where people go, economic opportunity emerges, and then they build the city that they'll live in.
Paul, in terms of the ingredients that have to be, introduced to the city, I've heard you talk repeatedly about law enforcement, but are court systems, how disputes are to be adjudicated and other things, is this part of what the, say in your suggestion, the European powers provide as structure so that this environment can bootstrap and take off?
Sure. I think it's important to focus not just on the police, but also the courts for handling, criminal law. To be honest, I suspect that contract law, which economists make a lot of fuss about, is probably less important. If you've got conditions of security, people can make deals, can engage in trade based on basically a reputational equilibrium. And as those deals become more and more complicated, you could eventually make recourse to a contract, explicit contracts, and courts that enforce them. But the fundamental challenge is to make sure that people feel safe from threat of violence. If you don't have that, you can't have even the principle of voluntary exchange. So I think the policing and the courts are an essential part of what has to be provided in the initial setup in a zone such as this.
Are there other dimensions, just to help our imaginations, that you would put on that laundry list in addition to policing and courts?
Yeah. Let me just digress for a second and say, I apologize that I wasn't able to come. The reason I'm not able to come is I actually have to make a trip to Colombia. The reason I have to go to Colombia is that we've been working with the government in Colombia to try and make room for their internal refugees, the displaced people, people displaced by violence in Colombia, and are trying to do this by increasing all of its urban area. So take especially the second-tier cities and encourage them to plan for rapid expansion so that they could accommodate the hundreds of thousands of people who are still not in permanent homes. Now, that experience shows that there's another dimension where the state has to be the first mover. And it's on something which may sound kind of prosaic compared to safety, but it turns out to be incredibly important for economic opportunity. If you've got land which people will occupy in at the densities of urban life, the government has to move first and define what will be the public space that will be used for mobility and utility corridors and, in a sense, all of the interconnections you want to make possible in a city. Those interconnections can only take place if you have the public space of the street, the sidewalk, and then using that land, the sewer pipe, the water pipe, the electrical wires, the bus that can take somebody from a place where they live to a place where they work. So what we're doing in planning for expansion in these cities in Colombia is making sure that the government sets aside the public space and then can let private individuals guide decisions about the private space, the blocks that are left over once you protect the public space. This is an initiative that doesn't take much money. It just needs a commitment from the state that you stake the public areas and you say, don't build in these, we're going to protect these. Eventually, we'll pave them and put pipes in them, and it'll support a modern city. Now, if you want to picture how this kind of city, this brand new Hong Kong, could evolve, think about starting from that state. Somebody has staked the public space, and this should include, of course, park space as well. Protect the riverfronts, the waterfronts, the green spaces. If somebody stakes the public space and then says, we're going to protect that, but you, the new residents, can occupy the private space, we've seen how this can unfold. There was a land invasion of some space outside of Lima, Peru, where the priests who led this invasion went in and staked 10-meter roads first. That area, instead of staying permanently as a slum, has grown into one of the most successful suburbs of Lima. A more sort of trendy example would be the Burning Man camp that emerges every year in Nevada. The organizers go in and they stake the streets, and then they say, all right, come in and build an occupation for yourself. And within a week, they have a city of 70,000 people up and running. So imagine that what this power does is say, we're going to have a police force, we'll have a court system for dealing with cases of violations of law, and we're going to protect the public space that will be essential for the success of this city. Beyond that, we're willing to let people pursue their own self-interest, build their own structures in many cases that they'll live in. Initially, they may be getting water off of a truck instead of from municipal water supply. The roads may be dirt. But as economic activity unfolds, employers will come seek these people out. And as economic activity unfolds, eventually local residents will decide to pay for paving and municipal water, and this city can evolve very rapidly into a successful, competitive worldwide center of commerce opportunity.
Let me keep on playing the devil's part, because I think that both Rob and I have this role to play today,
sure.
So to get some discussion. It's very difficult to engineer the growth of a town or to create from scratch a conurbation. There are also some of the examples that you were making, if I understand correctly, are examples of areas around the cities that already exist. So you are recovering and you are restructuring areas, slums and other areas that are around existing cities, rather than creating from scratch a new town. And I believe this is also a large town, the one that would host, we are talking about millions of refugees here, so it would be large. So clearly there are in the world many examples of failures, including in China. There are all of these ghost towns that have been created. True, in this case, people would go there, must go there to some extent. So you would have already the person there being resident, but by force to a large extent, by coercion. Which is clearly a different situation. And the economy of these areas would be mainly, if I understand, driven by housing, building, and construction, more than, typically when a new town is created, it is based on some economic factor, trade or natural resources, other things. So, no, I don't know. It's not an easy
sure.
process, I would say.
Yeah, well, let me, and I think it's good to sort of challenge an idea like this, and we should also be thinking about what are different directions we could take it that are still consistent with this idea of pragmatism. The vision I have is that you have to have some source of exchange with the rest of the world, because you're going to be acquiring resources from the rest of the world. In the process of economic development, there's a kind of a natural sequencing that takes place. The first industry which would emerge there is almost surely going to be garment assembly. There are firms that will travel all over the world and can very quickly set up garment assembly operations that offer jobs to people sewing shirts and blouses. This strikes many of us as a kind of a grim prospect, because you wouldn't want someone to be stuck in a job like that forever. But what we see over and over again is that these kinds of jobs as first jobs for people become the stepping stone to jobs that involve much more skill. And it's typically skill that people acquire on the job. So imagine in the early stages that this is a place which is in competition with Bangladesh for garment assembly. It'll have better logistics to Europe. It'll have better logistics within the city itself, because you've protected the public space. If you've made enough room for expansion, there'll be abundant land which will be available. So it'll actually be cheaper for somebody to own a house. It might be a house that they build on land that they're given. So it starts with garment assembly, light manufacturing, kinds of activities that are migrating away from coastal China. And then it, just like Hong Kong, it moves quickly up kind of the scale of productive activities as the human capital of the residents there unfolds. So that's, and construction is part of it, but unless there's some trade with the rest of the world, probably facilitated by direct foreign investment, I don't think it'll succeed. Now, and one other thing I think is worth keeping in mind is if we started several of these places and some of them didn't succeed, that would be perfectly okay, because there's almost no cost in setting one of these things up the way you set up Burning Man. You go stake the public space and you say, hey, if people want to come, they can come. If nobody comes, that's a very reassuring sign. Things aren't that bad in the places that they're leaving from. And if nobody comes to this one, but they go to some other one, which offers a slightly different set of arrangements, well, that tells you they preferred the other one instead of the first one. So I think the process of defining the political jurisdiction, defining things like a permanent right of abode, which is distinct from, say, citizenship in the European nation. I think defining those things is very inexpensive, and we should try it. And if it doesn't succeed, that'll actually be a very reassuring sign.
Okay, do we have questions from the audience? And Paul, we'll try, if you can't hear well, we'll try to distill them and reframe them. So,
sure. Yeah, actually, let me just say one other thing. What could lead? What do I think is a source of failure, a likely source of failure? I think there are tens of millions of people who would leave at a drop of a hat if they could go someplace where it was just safe and they could just get a job. I think one thing that could lead to a failure is if we replicate the experience of refugee camps and we say, in effect, the people who move to these places are prohibited from working. Now, that would clearly be a foolish and wasteful thing to say. We could have that same effect if we said, well, you can work here as long as you get a decent minimum wage of, 10 euros, 15 euros, because we don't want to allow exploitation of local labor. That kind of labor market restriction could deprive people of the chance to get a first job in something like garment assembly, to learn skills about quality control, about teamwork, about interaction with supervisors, and about marketing, design related to these areas. So I think that if I were to think about a failure mode, I think it's most likely one that we create conditions of security, but we don't give people a chance to work.
Yeah, what you are saying is very important. Indeed, it goes even beyond your proposal. The problem with some of the policies we have with refugees is that we do force them not to work, even if they come to our countries, because there is also this long waiting period before they could start being productive, and that creates the type of problems that you were mentioning before. But there are a few questions from the floor, including one, if I understand, from Jesus Fernandez Huertas Moraga, who presented a few days ago a very insightful proposal about how to, because you were talking about some EU states, and clearly there is a problem of coordination across EU states, and he was talking more about relocation and resettlement, but I think his proposals are worth talking about. So perhaps when Jesus wants to say something else about this and also react to your proposals.
Sure.
Okay, so I found your proposal really interesting. And what our proposal has in common with yours, according to what you just mentioned, is to give the possibility to refugees to choose what's going to be their preferred location. So in your case, this would be these new cities. We were also proposing that countries unwilling to receive refugees could pay a compensation to other countries that would be willing to receive these refugees. So in this case, we could add your new cities. But more exactly on your proposal, what I would like to ask you about is what could go wrong in some sense. Yeah. And I would like to ask you about one point that you already mentioned, which is the existing refugee camps. So some of these refugee camps are really large, hundreds of thousands of people. We can think about them in Kenya and Tanzania. Even for Western Sahara, you know that there are Western Saharan people that are staying in refugee camps in Algeria. So I would like to ask you to go a little bit deeper into what's wrong with these places, why they are not developing into these new cities with opportunities that you are envisaging. Yeah. And then I'm thinking of another historical example. You've talked about Hong Kong, and I would like you to comment on Israel, on the history of Israel.
Yeah, all good, yeah.
And how it relates to your proposal.
Sure, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, one pragmatic track that is kind of can operate independently of what I'm describing is a track that many people are working on, and your work may be part of this, about trying to move from people trapped in refugee camps where they can't work to a situation where we allow them to work. And I think that's a track that's very worth pursuing because those people are already in place, and it's doing enormous harm that they can't work. I think these two possibilities could complement each other in the following sense. Imagine that there are some refugee camps where the local host government, for political reasons, cannot allow the refugees to work. To just not be condescending about this, if we had a refugee camp with like 10 million refugees living in the United States, I'm almost certain that our current political environment would not allow them to work. There's so much political animosity and hostility towards immigrants. I think we would do the same thing in the United States that a country like Jordan has done. So we have to recognize that it's really hard to get a country to allow people who've entered essentially in a way that doesn't follow the legal mechanisms for migration, to let those people work. But we should push as hard as we can to get countries to face reality and let that happen. But in parallel, we should create places where these people could go. So everybody who's currently stuck in a refugee camp is told, you now have some options. If you're not happy here, you could always go back home, but you could also move to one of these new zones where as soon as you get there, you can get a job. And I think this would be beneficial from the point of view of giving some sense of agency, some sense of control to people who now feel helpless, trapped in these camps. So I think the kind of allow work in camps agenda is complementary to this one that I'm articulating. Now, your question about Israel. Hong Kong was very beneficial in the sense not only that it offered opportunity for the people who moved into Hong Kong, but indirectly it had real benefits for mainland China that was nearby. If you look at the history of Israel, Israel has offered opportunity for people who have moved in within its borders, but it has not facilitated that same kind of spread of opportunity and self-determination to the areas nearby. So you'd want to think, carefully about what would make this evolve more like the experience in Hong Kong and less like the experience in Israel. I think in retrospect, one of the mistakes, if you could do it over, one of the things you'd do differently is not to try to, say, create a new power that takes control over a place where people live and a place where people want to live or they lived before, because they will naturally resist the imposition of a regime that doesn't reflect their interests. So I think the decision to create Israel in a place where many people were already residents, and there's a long history of residents there, I think that created conditions of hostility that made it very difficult to have the kind of inclusion you want in a successful place. So I would look for a place that is as sparsely inhabited as possible, a place where almost nobody lives, somewhere on the coast. And if you have to supply it with water from desalination and recycling, we know how to do that. That's not very expensive. But if you can start with a place where there's no history of grievance and entitlement, and say, come, please, if this is attractive, but by all means, don't come if this is offensive to you. I think that helps encourage an evolution like that of Hong Kong rather than an evolution like that in Israel. I think the other thing that's was a side effect of the conditions of hostility is that it's very difficult to have a truly inclusive society that's committed to equal treatment for everyone when people feel threatened by violence. And so Israel has really struggled with creating the sort of implementing this commitment to inclusion for people who are not from, or for Arab residents of Israel. So I think you'd want to push very hard in the direction in any new place that you create of equal treatment for all residents. And this is another place where the pragmatism kicks in. If you let many new migrants move into Europe, what we would typically do, or the United States, what we typically do is say, okay, well, you're not voters, you don't get the right to vote, but you can live and work in this environment. The interesting thing about Hong Kong is that by saying, the electoral control of your officials comes outside, it has a disadvantage that you don't have local electoral control. But as I said with the Sunnis and Shiites, that might actually be an advantage in the beginning. But more subtly, it allows you to bring in new citizens at a rapid pace and still to treat everybody the same. You don't have to have a distinction between those who are citizens and those who are temporary migrants, who might be long-term migrants, maybe someday become citizens. So to summarize, I think that making participation optional by starting someplace where people don't already live, and then by committing to equal treatment of everybody, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their religious persuasion, equal treatment under the law, I think, is in conditions where people feel safe. Those are the best conditions under which to, I think, emphasize education, opportunity, inclusion, and ultimately social harmony.
We have another question now from Francesco Anesi, if I understand. Let me know if there are more people willing to ask questions. So
Professor Romer, thank you for a very unexpected but enlightening intellectual exercise of imagination. As you clearly demonstrated, there is an economic case to be done for failed state. And we discussed in the past few days here in Trento about the economic case for refugee crisis. UNHCR mentioned the fact that they need something like an investment of 70 million in order to duplicate the revenue that they could have in the longer term. Or Professor Dustman from UCL said you need to be careful not to move refugee into rural area because that might increase, a 1% increase in those areas will increase by 1% or more the level of populism in those areas, whereas cities can absorb much better the refugees. My questions are the following. I mean, as you clearly demonstrated, as I said, there is an economic case to be done, and economists have a duty to perform into it. So the question is, what is the role of economists in performing the role into the public sphere for public goods when an economic case is to be done? Now, if this question is too broad, the alternative question might be, how does your proposal fit into the research agenda that we are seeing nowadays? Thank you very much.
Yeah. This is a good question. So Rob, you're right. This is a great festival. I wish I could be there. I think economists have not done a good job of grappling with this question, because in effect, there's a joke we tell about economics where the punchline is, assume you have a can opener. It's a joke about how to open a can. What what economists tend to do about refugees is assume we have a place where we can have conditions of safety and inclusion in the political process, and then ask, what's the effect of bringing the refugees in? And the answer there is it's clearly beneficial if you bring the refugees in. They take less in terms of additional support than they generate in tax revenue. They create more economic value than they capture for themselves. So economists have, I think, presented this kind of falsely optimistic picture of what would be possible in terms of bringing large numbers of refugees into Europe, because we haven't addressed the political and social costs associated with large-scale migration. And the voters understand these other costs very clearly, and they think the economists are just nuts. And so I think the economists have to address the social and political costs, not just the economic costs of large-scale migration. But let me say that the reason I think the economists go astray is that if you look at cases where you have a very small inflow of immigrants, the political and social costs are negligible. So economists act as if you can just scale those up and those costs will stay small. But the problem is the political and social costs grow superlinearly. They grow much faster than with the rate of the number of new immigrants. So what we should be doing as economists is saying, okay, we understand that there are political and social costs we've got to manage as well. Let's take account of all of those and come up with a feasible proposal. And as part of this, let's recognize that we're going to start some new opportunities where we can treat everybody the same, where we can provide inclusion. Let's be realistic that it might take decades to build a stable democratic system rather than months. And this is the mistake the U.S. has chronically made, is thinking that an election held within months is going to lead to a stable democratic system, and it just doesn't work. So we need something more like, as I said, the British kind of transition to democracy in Mauritius. So I hope economists start to recognize the reality of the political and social challenges, but they should still keep making their basic point that the fiscal costs are negligible. I mean, Hong Kong didn't cost British taxpayers anything because it generated its own local revenue and was hugely successful. So it is true that more immigrants can actually pay for themselves in a new city, but we got to make that case, and at the same time make the case that we have to manage the difficult challenge of creating a sort of a stable, cohesive society that will be durable.
Another question there from the floor.
Yes, good morning to you. My name is Georgios Bampata. I work as an investor, specifically in a social impact fund. I just wanted to make if I can say that, can make a reference to, quite funny, the reference to Burning Man, because for those of us who have been, actually, the economic activity during Burning Man is not the most prevalent human activity. So, sure. But the question is actually, you devoted a lot of time thinking what would be the initial condition for setting up such an area, so security, infrastructure. I would imagine the governments play a big role in setting up this ideal setting, but I would imagine at some point proper real economic activity apart from the states have to kick in, and maybe there would be a contribution from the dismal science to say, to tell us what would be the rule of the games of economic activity. We expect something growing from the ground. And secondly, if we wanted to mobilize, funds like ours, or all, the large economic power of social impact investors, what would be the rules of the game for those people that also want to have an economic activity and not just charity in this type of environments?
Sure. Yeah. First, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that given the scale of what we're facing, there are hundreds of millions of people who say when asked they would like to move to a new country. So we're dealing with a scale of at least hundreds of millions, and it could well end up being in the billions, 1 or 2 billion who want to move. So we have to realize that philanthropic funds relative to the scale of the challenge are very, very small. So what we have to do is we have to prioritize the use of those philanthropic funds. We have to ask, where could they generate enormous returns by allowing all the other things that can happen from basically mutually beneficial exchange, the thing that humans rely on for everything we do at scale. So to be clear, I would not use philanthropic funds in a new site to pave the roads, to lay water pipes, lay sewer pipes, build buildings. All of that stuff can come through this process of mutually beneficial exchange. I think the philanthropic funds should be devoted to creating the jurisdiction so that we have a place where it's like Hong Kong, people can freely enter and they've got kind of legal status there. And then providing the security guarantees provided by a good system of policing and courts. Now, I understand that Burning Man it only lasts a week, so it doesn't illustrate, permanent employment opportunities. But I think it does illustrate how this city a new city could grow. Literally, you stake the streets, that defines some private land, what'll be the streets and sidewalks someday. That defines the private lands, and you could say to people, if you occupy a lot in the private land, it's yours. If you build a house on this land, it's yours. And again, what could a philanthropic funds do? Imagine what the philanthropic funds do is test and publicly announce the quality of the water that starts to be delivered on trucks. There would quickly emerge entrepreneurs who'd be selling water on trucks. People would dig latrines for sanitation. But it would be good to have somebody who assures buyers that the water is safe. So think of that as the kind of role for philanthropy, but think about the water delivered on the truck is by an entrepreneur. The factory that hires people for garment assembly is led by an entrepreneur. Some firm that wants to build an airport hub where, say, dresses are flown to high fashion houses in Paris every day. There are entrepreneurial entities that would even build and operate an entire airport. So save those philanthropic funds for those very few basics of creating the conditions required for success.
There is a lady here on the front.
Signore, buonasera.
I will translate it for you.
Io vorrei chiedere all'America, soprattutto,
Good afternoon.
il muro in Israele.
I would like to ask you to break down the wall in Israel. Please remove that wall and create two nations. That would be the only way to have peace. Thank you.
Kind of a political statement about the wall in Israel, and she's saying that there is no need for walls in Israel.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that this kind of idea has some bad associations with it, and it's not guaranteed that it would succeed. But let me go back to what I said in the beginning about the medic. We have thousands of people dying every week right now, and that should give some real urgency to our decisions. There's nothing honorable about just standing by and doing nothing in conditions that are so dire. So it's true that we could take risks by doing something. We could create conditions that don't work. But if we do that, we can adjust course. And we have to stop being so afraid. We can't just look away. We have to do something.
There's another question there. I think we take two more and then...
Hello, I have a more different kind of question that is about inclusion in a political process, which I found very interesting. The new state that you're imagining, wouldn't there be hostility against the imposed set of values that you speak about? There are more Western democratic values, and wouldn't there be the culture would not feel imposed by these values and would be hostile against these values when their own values, let's say of this other culture, could be, for example, the Sharia, which is the Islamic law?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, this is another very important practical issue. If you could start a couple of these states, it might be an interesting exercise to try and say, well, here's one where we're going to fully accommodate the kind of values that prevail in Europe. You might have another where you say, here we're going to try and support certain kinds of more traditional values. For example, we might support local regulations about dress for men and women. A certain level of modesty we're going to require in how people dress. If we can set up both of these kinds of places, it would be interesting to see which ones people choose. And it wouldn't just be about dress. It could be about availability of alcohol. There's a variety of ways, I think, you could tailor the local rules. Now, there's clearly a limit to what any European power will support. I mean, no European power is going to support a new city where genital mutilation is the accepted practice. So we have to be realistic that this is only variation within, an acceptable realm. But I think if people have the choice to enter, and they could even have a choice between more than one place, I think that goes a long way towards avoiding the resentment that you alluded to. It was interesting. In Hong Kong, there was very little desire for local democratic control of, for example, of the police force. And the move towards local democracy only emerged when it became clear that the transition was going to hand control back to the mainland Chinese government. So, you could easily imagine residents being very happy living in a city, in some ways like Washington, D.C., where some, much larger entity is actually in control of the politics of the city. But you could also imagine a gradual devolution of some powers to the city itself. By the way, one other thing I forgot to mention is that you have to think about, back on the question of Israel and tolerance of this zone, you have to think about the benefits for people who are not in the zone as well as for the ones who are in the zone. I think in Libya, for example, it would be very useful if you could set up a couple of these zones, maybe even just one of these zones on Libyan soil. One of the commitments could be that every Libyan who wants to take refuge in this secure, safe zone would have the right to do so. And in a sense could have a kind of, they could move to the front of the queue ahead of people coming from other areas. This, for Libyans, think about a Libyan family, this would be potentially very valuable because the security situation there is very tenuous. And, if they knew there was a safe place, like European security, they could get their children to without having to risk a crossing of the Mediterranean, that would give them a kind of an assurance that would be quite valuable. A new emerging Libyan government could also benefit from, say, some lease payments that might come along with this kind of lease arrangement. So I think there are ways to design this so that it would be attractive to people who'd want to move and live there, but would also offer benefits to people who are part of the country that engages in this arrangement.
I think this is the last question we take.
Okay, I try to be as short as possible. First, in terms of political feasibility, because this concerns with the reasons why a state fails. In some cases, it was due to the fact that a weak institutional arrangement was torn apart by international tensions, so rival international interests. So this kind of strong one-state intervention in one territory could not trigger an international competition of this sort, so those cities could turn from civic outposts into military outposts, first. And the second is, why specifically cities? Because in some cases, if you stress too much the role of the conurbation model, you could end up drying up the countryside and the more scattered areas of the country, so in a way emptying territory that needs to be looked after and seen to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. So these are all great questions. I think it would actually be a good thing if many different countries tried to compete by setting up such zones. So imagine Sweden says, we want to set one up in Libya. Imagine China says, we want to set one up in the Western Sahara. And, imagine the United States says, okay, we want to set one up too, and Russia says we want to set one up too. I think that kind of competition, if it could all take place in a framework where every place guarantees that people have the right to enter and leave, that kind of competition would be a good thing. If you could structure it by some kind of treaty-like commitment, it would be more reassuring to everybody, I think, if there was a firm commitment that no outside power would use this to create a military base. It shouldn't become a port that's an important military port. It shouldn't be an important base for aircraft. It might not be possible to avoid some military presence in these different places. And then I think we really have to think hard like medics and say, well, okay, what if it did lead to military bases, some Chinese, some Russian, some European, some US, some Indian, many parties could get involved in this. All these countries have to learn how to live with each other in a kind of stable worldwide system. I think they could live with each other in maintaining these stable outposts as well. So I would prefer a kind of competition where these were not militarized zones. But if it was a choice of no zones at all, or zones where there is some military presence, I think it would be better to have some of these zones. The point on which I think one can't compromise is on entry and exit, that people can't be trapped in by something like a new version of the Berlin Wall. The final point about, urban life is that, look, where people want to go is to cities. They don't want to go to rural areas. We heard about the potential disruption that can come if you force them into rural areas. And recall that protecting large swaths of land significantly increases the burden, the security burden for any power that's providing security. So I think the only practical solution going forward is Hong Kong scale urban environments, which are not expensive to keep safe, and agriculture, which is going to take place in countries that are farther along in the the state building process.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Paul. I want to conclude by sharing with you two thoughts that occurred to me as this was proceeding. The first of which is listening to you with a very broad imaginative scope, and your ability to integrate across disciplines and take on powerful challenges reminded me that many years ago I had worked in Washington, and after I had moved to New York, I got on the Amtrak train. And Paul, I've told you this story. I went from New York to Washington and had one of the most fascinating train rides of my entire life. I was on a very busy train seated with a gentleman who had a vivid imagination, was gregarious and inspiring. About 3/4 of the way through, he started to explore with me my background and training, and he said, "Well, you should meet my son." And it turned out the man I was riding on the train with was Roy ROMER, Paul's father, who then introduced us. Yeah. And today's the fruit of that initial good fortune. So I want to thank you, Paul. INET is very proud that you deliver one of our lectures, and we hope in the future that you will, continue to inspire whatever the theme, and that we can attract you here in person, which I know was your intention until you had to go to Columbia.
And Rob, please, if you can think of a way to do it, pass on my email address to anybody who'd like to follow up with me, or give me a list of the attendees and I'll write them, because I'm sure there are many thoughts people would like to share, and I'm keen to listen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for offering this, Paul. And really, we do hope, as I join Rob in saying that we would be very pleased to have you here in person next year, one of a future edition of this festival.
Yeah. So I have one second thought. Tito, you weren't here at the outset when I made my introductory remarks. And as I listened to you talk about setting up refugee camps and the idea of a refugee no-show, meaning things were so good that no one had to come, I thought about the Trento Economic Festival and my role as the head of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And immediately I came to the state of mind that if no one showed to the Trento Economic Festival, I would have to convene psychiatrists to understand what was wrong with the world. Given the state of the economics profession and this extraordinary experience, if people didn't show, we could say the push, the pull, but we would need psychological help. And in no small measure, the need for that psychological help is shown in this tremendous experience through the vast knowledge and imagination and the smile of the man who sits next to me. Each year I come here, each year we work together, and I enjoy learning from you. I enjoy experiencing your vision. Well, and INET thanks Paul, Tito, and all of you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. No, it is Rob who is really organizing this event. So thank you so much, Rob. Thank you.